Good morning, everyone, and good morning, everyone joining us online. We've got people still coming in from church, and so we're going to go ahead and get started because I want to make sure we use every minute that we have. Want to, first of all, start out before I introduce our guest, who probably needs no or very little introduction here at All Saints Church, to thank the Racial Justice Ministry. And Clara and Carol are here because they've really helped partner in bringing this forum on. And I actually asked y'all if there's anything you want to step up and say and sort of educate us and let us know about what's going on with the Racial Justice Ministry. So.
We're glad to see you all here this morning. Is that on? Right. Yeah, it's great to see you all here this morning. We have an exciting event coming up next week that we're calling the inaugural event of several that's called That's My Story. So we want to learn from one another. We talk here a lot about the value of story, and we're learning to tell the whole story. And so next week we'll hear from Lindy Scott at 1 o'clock in the, at 1 o'clock in the seminar room, and there'll be some opportunity to reflect, to ask questions, to consider our own stories and how they might intersect with what we learned from Lindy.
So next Sunday, if you come to church, we'll be in the seminar room from 1 to 2:30, and if you're online, if you can catch us on Zoom, it's in the bulletin. And we would just love to have you come in hear Lindy Scott, and as well know that we meet every second Sunday at 1 o'clock, and now it's hybrid in the seminar room and on Zoom. So thank you.
Thank you all very much. I guess I should introduce myself. Yeah, thank you. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector here at All Saints Church, and thrilled to have back with us our good friend Andre Henry, who is an award-winning singer-songwriter of soulful, empowering pop anthems fighting for the world that ought to be. He is probably the curator and host of the Hope and Hard Pills podcast. And just this last month, and what is number 12 regionally, is selling, so you better get it. He is the author of All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep, which is a phenomenal book. They're selling so fast, I think we only have 7 copies left over there, but you can go to Romans and get them. And just today, whenever we do books in the future, we're going to make sure we have cash. We don't have any, it's credit card only today. But you can just jump on it. If you can't get one here, because these are going to sell out, jump on over to Romans. They've got them there. And you can obviously just order them online if you want. But can we give a welcome to Andre Henry? So, first of all, this book is incredible, and it's so vulnerable, and it's like an internal travel log of your journey. And so, first of all, there's got to be a cost to writing that, and thank you for paying that price and sharing this with us. And can you just kind of talk about the journey of this book and what made you write this down?
Hello, there it is. Yeah. There's a little switch on this microphone.
That's right.
And studies show when you touch the power button
That's right.
on electronics, they work better.
Yeah.
So for a long time, I felt like I wanted to write a book. I didn't think that I would write a book about racial justice, and I didn't think that I would write a book, like you said, that is so vulnerable about my own life. But the book came about because at that time, I think it was 2019, so it had been about 5 years or so of me writing, speaking, making videos, writing songs, whatever I can to tell the truth about what Black life is like in America. And by that time, there had been a bunch of white folks that I really loved very deeply, friends, some of them I called family, that our relationships had completely deteriorated by that point. And some of them had been online saying things like, Andre's a racist, he hates white people, da 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 da. So I said, you can't say those kinds of things without a receipt. Like, show me the tweet, show me the text message, show me the email, play me the audio recording. When did I ever say that? So I decided to write these people a receipt of my love for them. And I wrote an open letter called To All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. And I explained in this open letter that I posted online that the reason why we are not together is because I have been going through a political awakening that has drawn me into the struggle for Black lives with my body, with all that I have, with all of my gifts, with all of my talents, and my time, and my energy, and my money, you know? And I invited you to come with me, and you said no. Not only did you say no, you called me a reverse racist. You told me I was crazy. You told me I'm imagining things, you know, and so on and so forth. That's why we're not together. Now, that blog went viral, which, by the way, people who write online, proofread your stuff, because I did not. And I was like, oh my gosh, I need to fix this. My terrible writing has gone. Hundreds of thousands of people are reading this blog, and a literary agent reached out and said that he felt like there was a book in there. And I said, you know, I'd never thought of it as being a book, you know, but I don't sell books professionally. You do. So if you feel like there is a book in there, then I'm happy to try. The book that the publisher wanted was basically, they would have been happy for me to just write a book that said, you know, here's some stories about some white people that said some racist things to me. Here's why they're wrong. They would have been happy with that book. But by the time I was done working on the book proposal, I realized that I really didn't want to expand that letter into a book-length open letter to people that I already knew weren't listening to me. And I didn't, and I realized by the time I was done with the book proposal, it was exhausting going over the same information that's already been covered in so many other anti-racism books. I wanted to write a book that delivered practical insight about civil resistance, because that is the aspect of fighting for racial justice that I feel is overlooked so often. When we talk about racial justice in this country, when I hear people talk about racial justice, so many people don't want to talk about power, you know? Many of you in this room have played Simon Says with me, so you understand what I'm talking about already when we talk about power. We don't address the issue of power, the issue of systems, the issue of structures, and how, let me just divert for just a second, and how individuals within a system can become agents of enforcing that system at the drop of a dime. Kind of like how in The Matrix, right? Like any person can become Agent Smith at any moment, right? And so I decided that I wanted to write that book. I said, you know, I'll give the publishers the book that they want, but I'm also going to write the book I think the world needs. And so, and I wanted to address Black people because we are all struggling underneath the same worldwide miseducation about this anti-Black global system that we live under. And the success of that project is to convince Black people not to fight for our own liberation, to convince Black people not to participate in protest and civil resistance and to do that. And so that's why I ended up writing the book. And I knew, so I talked with Lisa Sharon Harper the other day, and she said, well, why didn't you name this book something like Rules for Radicals 2 or something like that, you know, so people would understand like that this book is about civil resistance. And I was like, because then you wouldn't buy it. You wouldn't, it wouldn't be on the shelf at Barnes & Noble and Target and Walmart if I had done that. I knew that telling a story, telling my story, would be more compelling, and it would put that information in places that it normally doesn't reach. Did you hit the
You're
power
right.
button too?
You're right. Power button.
Look at us.
I know. Always learning.
Yeah.
Do you want to share a piece of that?
Sure.
Give us a reading.
Yes, I'm going to read. I'll read about, how much time do we have? Because I've been doing about 6 minutes, but 6 minutes?
Yes,
Okay.
that's great. We got an hour all told. So we're
Okay,
fine.
great. This is from chapter 2, and I see people with their books out, so if you want, it's on page 17. The whole world is Stone Mountain. I was raised in the shadow of Confederate Mount Rushmore, in a small Georgia town called Stone Mountain. The place gets its name from a giant piece of quartz that stands about a mile high at the edge of town. The mountain's north face hosts the largest bas-relief carving in the world, a giant depiction of Confederate generals Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and Confederate President Jefferson Davis on horseback. It was commissioned by Klan sympathizers who'd initially hoped to include a parade of Klansmen in the carving. At 190 feet across and 90 feet tall, it's the largest Confederate monument in the country. The modern Ku Klux Klan first set fire to a cross on that very rock. One 4th of July, my sweet mother, a hard-working immigrant, took my siblings and me to picnic at Stone Mountain Park. As night fell, she spread a blanket on the damp grass at the mountain's base and passed around half-frozen Capri Suns as we prepared to watch the famous laser show spectacular, where the generals go dark and fast-paced cartoons are projected against the mountainside to popular music. As the show began, Mom, Mackie we called her, couldn't stop grinning. She leaned in close with a smile and said, "There's a part where they make the soldiers move." She seemed as excited about the imminent resurrection of General Lee as most Americans are about the fireworks grand finale. I was excited too, imagining a kind of night at the museum situation where those stone sentinels would peel themselves away from the rock and dance to the crisscross song Jump. After a few cartoons sent to country music I was too young and black to recognize, the show paused, the lights dimmed. The sound of a rolling snare drum came dragging its feet through the speakers. It was followed by the voice of Elvis Presley singing, "I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland." As the music crescendoed, a laser began to slowly trace the carved figures until they were all standing in multicolored stenciled glory. Then the flickering silhouette of General Lee, I kid you not, turned his gaze on us mortals below, put on his hat, kicked his horse, and began to ride. Jackson and Davis followed as Elvis changed choruses, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, his truth is marching on." At first, the three men's steeds took a dignified pace. Then General Lee spurred his horse into a gallop, and the other Confederates followed suit. Lee drew his sword and held it high above his head as the three rebels turned toward us in full-on charge. The sound of hundreds of people hooting and clapping and cheering filled the air. In hindsight, it seems odd that people would commemorate America's birthday by applauding three men who once declared war on the country. Even odder is the memory of my black mother wiggling her hips at the thought of a family picnic on the very ground where the KKK was resurrected, all while "I Wish I Was in Dixie" played in the background. If Mackie had recognized the laser show for what I do now, white supremacist pageantry, she might have marched our family right out of that neo-Confederate theme park and across the Caribbean Sea in a fury to raise us in her home country. But none of us were furious because we didn't really know the history. There was no mention of the ties between Stone Mountain and the Klan in Stone Mountain Park. They covered it up. In Stone Mountain, the racist content of mundane American life was obscured by a big lie told throughout the white world. The lie the white world tells is, racism is not a problem here, no matter where here may be. White people from the southern U.S. claim they're not racist because they're not members of the Proud Boys. Northern whites claim they're not racist because they're not Southerners. European whites claim they're not racist because they're not Americans. Latino whites claim they're not racist because they're not Europeans or Americans. Nevertheless, the white world stands guilty of a crime of unfathomable scope. Some call it the maafa, a Swahili word meaning something like great disaster, referring to the 15 million indigenous Africans violently abducted from their homelands to be sold as beasts of burden in the so-called New World. They were held as captives in work camps, tortured and terrorized for generations. Their descendants have continued to suffer through endless innovations of racial violence throughout history, including apartheids and poverty, police brutality and surveillance, imperialist wars, and outright terrorism. The Ma'afa's body count is innumerable. That's why some black scholars call it the Black Holocaust. Contrary to what people love to say about racial violence, that it springs from ignorance or blind hatred, the Ma'afa wasn't and isn't senseless. The crime was undertaken for a reason: profit. Over and over again in their writings about the slave trade, white men spoke of how they must use the sweat and suffering of enslaved Africans to build their banks and textile industries, their ships and plantation homes, and to produce whatever else they needed to buy or sell: their coffee, tea, sugar, rum, cotton, indigo. It was just business. Much of the world is implicated in the crime and the cover-up. Britain couldn't have become great without their work camps in Jamaica. But British schools don't spend a lot of time teaching about the violence the British Empire wrought in its colonies. In 2005, the French government tried to pass legislation that urged schools to emphasize the positive role of colonialism, while schools glossed over the Black rebellion that ended French enslavement in Haiti. Brazil sweeps its history of anti-Black ethnic cleansing under the rug of racial democracy, suggesting that the same country that once ran the world's largest slave market now has little to no racism. In 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center surveyed students from 1,000 schools in the U.S. and found that fewer than half of them had ever heard of the Middle Passage. My point is that complicity in this atrocity is as widespread as the denial. The many nations who've benefited so much from the Ma'afa lack the moral courage to confess that the breaking of Black bodies is a central part of their stories.
Let's just sit for a second. I got to say, it's one of those moments, and the only reason I wasn't clapping is because my hands are holding things, that at the same time I'm wondering, why are we clapping? It's the courage for that, but it's one of those things that's if I let that really seep in, and I think what that means for me and for us, as generally not an applause line. And so I just want to sit with that for a second and say thank you. The story that you tell in it, and this runs throughout the book. There's a line here talking about the pageantry on Stone Mountain. You said, if Mackie had recognized the laser show for what I do now, and you talk about this book as an awakening. Yeah. And there a consistent line throughout this book is, what are the things that are right in front of our face all the time that you have come to realize are different than what they're being sold to us at. They're not a big deal. No, they are a big deal. They're not things that other people are bringing race into. It's like, oh no, race is there. And just like a few paragraphs later, you talk about the word gaslighting, and where that comes from. It says it comes from a 1938 play called Gaslight, in which a man meddles with his wife's gas-powered lights and tell her they're only flickering in her head. And it's living in this liminal space, and it's a lot of what you describe, where you are beginning to learn something that the world is not the way it has been sold to you, and yet all the people who are still living in that world are not only telling you that you're crazy, they're getting mad at you for trying to point that out. Can you talk a little about that sort of process of awakening?
Of course. So Frantz Fanon says something in his book, A Dying Colonialism, that as the oppressed are pursuing their liberation, we are transformed in the process. And I could say like that is kind of what this book is there comes a moment where I say, I am tired of feeling powerless as I watch people like me bleed to death on the internet, as I see the headlines of another unarmed black civilian killed by the police or whatever, and I say, I need to learn everything that I can about systemic racism. I need to learn everything that I can about nonviolent struggle, and I need to invest my body in the struggle for black liberation. And in the process of me pursuing that, I am changed as an individual. And that, you see that in the book. And also, it reveals, it unveils a lot of anti-black sentiment in people that I had considered friends and family my whole life, right? And they become my biggest opposers.
Yeah, you use that word reveal, and throughout the book you use a theme of apocalypse.
Yes.
Can you talk about that term and what it means to you in this context?
Yes, I love apocalypses. Because, and I didn't when I was young, and I write about this, growing up, because I grew up in the evangelical world in the era of Left Behind and all of that. So I had this dreadful fear of the apocalypse, because in culture, an apocalypse it's just the end of the world, right? But in the ancient world, apocalypses was a deeply political literary genre that used dramatic imagery to talk about the world as it is right now and to unveil the violence that is usually concealed by imperial ideology. So when you read a passage like Revelation 13, Revelation is just our English rendering of the Greek word apocalypsos, so Revelation is an apocalypse. When you read Revelation 13 and understand that people at that time in the first century used to refer to Rome as the beast, then you know that the beast of the sea is not Barack Obama. It's not even Donald Trump. You know what I'm saying? Like how all these evangelicals try to find some contemporary world figure and say, oh, that's the beast. No, the beast was Rome. And there's this many-headed beast has all these crowns on its head because they represent heads of state. And what John is doing is much like a political cartoonist. He is saying the story that Rome tells about itself, that it is a peace bringer by bringing all of these territories under the rule of Caesar, is a lie. Caesar is not a handsome God. Caesar is a monster. And the fact that in the chapter before, the dragon, who John tells you represents Satan, because sometimes they need to throw you a bone, he's saying that the empire is demonic. It is satanic in its nature, in the political project that it has to dominate other peoples, right? And John wrote Apocalypsos because he was a pastor and he saw his congregation, his compatriots, beginning to be taken in by the imperial ideology of Rome through the cult of Caesar. And so when these people start worshiping Caesar, he writes Apocalypsos as an intervention to say, because he doesn't want to see happen to them what empires are so good at doing, which is making patriots of oppressed people. And so I write about my awakening within that context, that black and brown people get the same education as white people, where white people are taught to internalize a sense of superiority to black people. And black and brown people are given a type of education that is supposed to instill a sense of inferiority. And there's nothing more that a domination system wants than for the dominated to just comply easily. Then we can spend less money on flashbang grenades and tanks and pepper spray and rubber bullets and all that kind of stuff that we meet protesters out there in the street with. So that's why I love, the idea of apocalypse and framed the story in that way, that in order for us to do the work of civil resistance, it begins with a political awakening.
I just want to take 3 minutes of meditation after each of these. What I will say is we're going to have a chance for conversation in here, and also if you're online, we use the same, you can text in your questions using the same number we use for text in prayers, and that's 910-839-8272, 910-839-8272, that's 910-TEXT-ASC. And someone's calling in right now. I want to sort of walk through a couple things and pull out a few things that you say that are just because first of all, what you just talk about in the whole process of gaslighting, I can't think of, you get an emotional reaction in your body when this happens. And you have a chapter called The Right to Remain Angry. And there's a couple pieces, I thought, whoa, okay, on a physiological level, anger is the body's way of telling us a boundary has been violated. It's trustworthy. Black rage is trustworthy because it carries an analysis of present injustices. Our anger is based in our personal experiences of anti-black hostility in the white world and backed by our knowledge of our history. Then you say black rage can be constructive because anger can be the starting point of hope. If anger is something like an alarm system telling us things ought not to be a certain way, then it is likely that we already hold some idea for how things ought to be. That vision of how things ought to be is the most important building block for a revolution. After all, it's hard to build a world we haven't envisioned. That's partly why I now tell people if they want to make a difference in the world for racial justice but don't know where to start, they should think about what makes them angry. Can you talk about anger and the right to remain angry, which is a great phrase, and then also, how do you make that hinge to hope and the vision of tomorrow?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I'll start with the social movement piece and work my way back because one of my mentors is a man named Bob Helvey. And Bob Helvey is a heavyweight in the history of nonviolent struggle. He actually helped activists in the Philippines in the people power movement in the 80s to organize against the dictatorship and that kind of thing. And so the reason I bring up Bob is because anytime someone wants to talk to Bob about changing the world, or any of his students like Sergio Popovich or any of those, he always starts with, what is your vision? Well, you can't talk with him about anything that you want to change unless you talk about the world that you think ought to be, right? And in that chapter, the right to remain angry, I connect those things and saying anger is the body's way of saying things should not be this way, right? So then if you lean into that, then hi Cheryl, then you can then you probably have an idea of how things ought to be if you lean into that, right? And so a part of my point with the gaslighting in chapter 1 and the trope of the angry black person is a part of that gaslighting that we bring into chapter, the right to remain angry, is people literally trying to keep us from taking those steps, right? If you're not allowed to be angry, that means you're not allowed to criticize, the status quo, right? And so we're trying, in all of these ways, what they're trying to do is keep us from being able to take action, and so, that's what I'm dealing with in that chapter. And I talk about how for a long time in my life, and I'm sure that there are many people in this room who could relate to this, that I wanted so badly to avoid being labeled angry because it's like code for bad Negro, right? Yeah, it's like you stay in your place, you know? And then I learned that it is entirely acceptable, justifiable, even healthy to be angry about the fact that we live in a world, that a society that was literally built on the idea that we are not human like everybody else, and we don't deserve the same amount of care, and we don't deserve the same amount of respect. In fact, without that feeling, we might not ever get involved in the movement for liberation.
You take a leap from that, and in the chapter, we do not debate with racists, which, again, I've followed you online about that, and it's great. And this was one of the parts of the book where it was just like, okay, I don't have enough ink in my pen to underline all this. And you talk about a Heineken ad.
Yes!
Yes. And it actually reminds me of when you were with Adam Schiff and you talked about how the police need to have at least as much integrity as Domino's Pizza, because they at least said that our pizza sucks and we're going to do better, but the police haven't done that yet. But I just want to read this portion of it. It says, you talk about a Heineken commercial. The company released an ad called Worlds Apart that made waves on the internet. The 4-minute commercial showed people who were political opposites having blind date-style conversations over a beer. They paired a climate change denier with an environmentalist, a self-proclaimed feminist with a male supremacist, a transgender woman and a transphobic cisgender man. Each pair spends some initial time getting acquainted and does a brief building project. Then the pair is shown a video in which the two participants themselves present a more strident version of their views, highlighting their differences. They're given a choice: leave the room or chat over a beer. All the pairs choose to talk. From the clips we see, all the conversations seem to go well. Americans believe our lives should be like that Heineken ad. That if we can just get proximate to one another, close enough to really see and be seen, we can overcome our differences and live happily ever after. While I agree that proximity has its merits, the commercial had the opposite effect on me than the company intended. The more I watch, the more I wonder, why should these representatives of persecuted minority groups have to sit down and convince someone else that their lived experiences are valid? These were not just differences of perspective. Some of these people have been put in a position to defend their very existence. That's not fair. Furthermore, watching those conversations play out made me realize that not all perspectives are valid or deserving of an audience. A transphobe is not entitled to tell a trans person, that they're mentally ill. A misogynist doesn't deserve to sit down with a woman to tell her she should be subservient to men. And I wasn't about to sit down with some white man, no matter our history, and explain to him why it would be wrong for someone to hold me as property. He should know that already, and if he's my friend, he should feel that already. The problem of racial injustice isn't just that people have differing opinions, but that some people are so dependent on anti-black violence that they can't imagine a world without it, while others of us are actually black. It's insulting to suggest that we should come together and debate over that. So,
yeah, I'm going to get in trouble. This is why I was so nervous about publishing this book, because I'm like, yeah, that's how I feel, and it's all over the country. So part of what I'm trying to do in this book is address some very wide-held misconceptions about how social progress happens. Because white people keep trying to tell us that the way that we will become free as black people is by debating with them. No. Look at history. That is not how it happened. Look at the Birmingham campaign of the Civil Rights Movement. You got a bunch of racists running this town. They got whites only signs up in the restaurants and in the businesses, over the water fountains, over the restrooms. Dr. King and the SCLC organized a campaign against segregation in Birmingham. Did they have mass conversations with white people? Not a part of the campaign. They shut the city down. That's how change happens. So I had a guy at Fuller Seminary who tried to defend chattel slavery to my face while I'm lugging a 100-pound boulder behind me to show the weight of racism on the black psyche. I am in mid-protest of anti-black violence, and this man tells me that the idea of chattel slavery had potential, and I see this Heineken ad that suggests that what I should do is give my valuable time and expose my mental health to this conversation. And I know it's small, but it's so emblematic of what people are always trying to tell us what to do. Well, if you don't talk to people like that, then how are they ever going to change? Well, why don't you talk to them? Right? And so I learned in that chapter something that we talk about is like the spectrum of allies. This is what I'm doing in every chapter, is debunking these myths about social progress and saying, no, actually, the thing that is going to move us forward is not me having individual conversations with racist white people. That's not what happened. That's not how it's what's going to happen. What we need is a massively organized, militantly developed, and I'm quoting Dr. King on both of those phrases, civil resistance campaigns until there is structural change. We don't need everybody. That's a part of the misconception that is going on in that chapter. Well, we need everybody. So that means you got to snatch every individual racist out of their racism. No, sir. There was a massive study of nonviolent movements throughout the world. They surveyed 627 conflict situations from 1900 to 2019, and they found that it only takes 3.5% of the population, any population, in sustained nonviolent civil resistance to revolutionize any society. No regime could withstand the sustained nonviolent action of just 3.5% of the population. Where do you get those numbers from? Not by arguing with Richard Spencer. It's not some binary where you have the most overt racist you can think of and then the most active anti-racist you can think of. There are people in between those poles of extremes who are much easier to move. And once we start thinking like that, then we stop wasting our energy with these strategies for racial justice that are never going to work. And this is what I'm dealing with in the book, is that in so many ways, people are trying to tell us that we can sidestep the revolution. We can sidestep the civil resistance part. And I know there might be some people sitting in here going, listen, my days of standing in the street in front of police tanks are over. But let me tell you something. That's the beauty of civil resistance campaigns, that anyone can participate. So let some of us young people go stand in front of the tanks, but you be ready to call some lawyers to get us out of jail.
Yeah, it reminds me, it was one night in St. Louis, Tracy Blackman was out with a group of protesters, and she loves telling the story. She said they were chanting, "We're young, we're strong, we're out here all night long." And she said, "I am not young, I am not strong, I'm going to be in bed at 10, but until then, have some water." And I thought, that was brilliant. That was her knowing what she could do and saying, this is how I can be a part of supporting this movement.
It's like I say, everyone has got a role to play. That's what I say.
Amen.
Every single time.
Amen.
Everyone has a role to play.
Everyone has a role to play. And then, and you touched on this with the 3.5% rule. It's actually, there's a scholar, I think she's at the University of Colorado, Erica Chenoweth, who is brilliant and has an amazing book that she's written on this about nonviolent civil resistance. Then you talk about, because one of the things about this book is, I found myself sort of like at different ports, like, okay, I'm not that white person. And then other ports like, oh my gosh, I am that white person. And it's like, and that's like, okay, I got to make sure I'm looking in the mirror at that point.
Yeah.
And this is a piece that the church, because we have it in our minds that being loving to everyone means we have to be nice to everyone, and that we have to sort of set these tables and everyone has to have civil conversation, which is also part of the not allowing people to be angry.
Yes.
And you write, here's the thing, in all my study and experience in nonviolent struggle, I can find no basis for white people's misconception that social change is brought about through civil conversations and peaceful protests.
No. Protests by definition are not peaceful.
Right.
By definition, you have to disturb the peace. Because what people call, what privileged people call in a violent society, what they call peace, is simply ignorance of the violence that oppressed people are experiencing. You have to disturb the peace. A part of that is, this misconception that we have about the civil rights movement, which is, I kind of addressed earlier, saying, people seem to think that Dr. King brought a couple people into Birmingham and had mass civil conversations with white people, and they took all the whites only signs down. No, actually, this is in the chapter, The Truth About Unity, because people think that there is this kind of broad-based unity that you build where it's basically like oppressed people are hugging their oppressors or hugging people who are passively supporting their oppressors. The unity that we need is unity among people who are fighting against racism. That is the unity that needs to be built. Outside of that unity, those people who are united to fight racism actually have to get very good at polarizing issues. They have to master the art of polarization. And I know everyone argues, like, that sounds like, I heard some people go, because what we hear right now is like, oh, we're more polarized than ever. That may not be bad news, not in every case, because what the civil rights movement did was they did polarize issues. When they brought people into Birmingham, I'm going to keep bringing the Birmingham campaign because it was so strategically done, so well done. And they made sure that they walked into these whites-only restaurants. Y'all don't think that was polarizing? People didn't like that. That's why they sicked dogs on my predecessors. They sit the water hoses on our predecessors and all that kind of stuff. And that was playing on TV, on the evening news. That was also polarizing because it drew a line in the sand. It said, okay, viewer, whose side are you on? Are you on Bull Connor's side? Or are you on the side of these children being brutalized by the police? That kind of polarization is useful, and that kind of polarization has historically been the way that social progress happens.
Wow. And one more, and then I want to open it up. And will you come back again? This is like too much for 1 hour.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. We got a group that's reading Reverend Gail Fisher Stewart's book, Black and Episcopalian, and it's great, and we spend most of our time in there, and Clara's leading this in a wonderful way, in affinity groups, and some of the conversation in the white affinity group is about whiteness. And I so remember being in this place myself where I'm like, well, does this mean I'm a bad person because I have white skin? And that took me, and I'm sure I still have a lot of that internalized too, so it's like such empathy for that. And we all need to be loved out of that. But so just two things that I want to link together that you wrote in the chapter, We Can All Be White. In a 2018 lecture entitled, Can White People Be Saved? Yale professor Willie James Jennings, remember that name, that is, oh my gosh.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, explained how the fusion of white identity and Christianity had been an essential part of the evolution of patriarchy, racism, and the climate crisis when he liberated himself from his notes for a moment. Anyone can be white, friends, he declared in a moment of spontaneous inspiration. In the recording, the energy in the lecture hall feels more like a Baptist church with yelps, claps, and hoots shooting through the auditorium. If you've not followed this so far, let me be clear, he continued. No one is born white. There's no white biology. Whiteness, he explained, is a way of thinking and being in the world. And then later you talk about white institutions, and it's the chapel building our own tables, about how hard it is to work in a white institution. And All Saints Church is a white institution, so I'm looking at this. And you say there are some hard pills to swallow about working in predominantly white institutions. And again, I'm remembering Willie Jennings' definition of white, especially for black people who hope to reform them. The first is that many of the leaders in these institutions are terrified of racial reform. That's because the white imagination often imagines racial reform will bring its institution to ruin. There's a perceived cost to being seen as concerned with the interests of black people. White businesses fear losing white customers, many white politicians fear losing white voters, and many white churches fear losing white parishioners unless they serve their needs exclusively. So as policy, they make it their business to serve white people at the expense of others. And it's that fear, and it's also, what that also speaks to me is for black people, for other people of color who choose to work in white institutions, there's a sacred trust that we are taking, inviting folks into our space, and they're doing it at great risk of peril to themselves. But of course, the whole project is of great peril to all of us. So I'd love, can you speak a little more about that?
What I thought of as you were reading some of that back to me is, and we've seen this historically, is that people underestimate, first off, the degree to which anti-blackness is entrenched in our society, right? They don't realize that it is not, it's in the mortar, right? It's not just it's not affixed to the structure. It's in the bricks. And because they underestimate the degree to which it is an essential part of the construction of these societies, institutions, cultures, they underestimate the degree to which reform has to happen, right? In order for us to live in a racially just society, everything has to change. Nothing will be the same. And that's why historically, when we start actually moving toward those things that will make us free, white people, even nice progressive white people, even liberal white people start going, oh, well, I didn't know we were going that far.
So are you saying it's not enough for us just to be liberal white people who invite Andre Henry to a forum?
That's exactly what I did. You know that sermon that I preached here, the spectacular intervention?
Oh, yeah.
You know what I kept asking God? Now, what do these white liberals need to hear? That's why that sermon sounds the way that it does. That's why there's that whole section of that sermon where I said, suppose you witness a mugging. Do you think you can stop the mugger by yelling after him, I disagree with you? I didn't say that accidentally to y'all. I said it because I knew what stage I was standing on. I know where I am. That's that chapter, White Men Explain Things to Me, right? And it happens, though. There is this thing where white people often say, I'm on your side, I agree with you, I want this too. But when we start talking about how every figure in your sanctuary has a white face, y'all sing Beethoven on Sunday morning. You know, nothing wrong with Beethoven. Hallelujah, 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 unto God's almighty Son. I know it. You know, but to be frank, that's white people stuff. You know? And when we start talking about what it would mean to actually make this place a place that is more welcoming, more comfortable for black and brown people, it might mean that some of that stuff has to change, you know? Now, I can say this because I don't get a paycheck from here, and none of you have my email address, and if you're mad, I'm gonna delete it anyway, you know? So, but, you know, we have to be careful that it doesn't become paternalistic and patronizing to say that we care about diversity here, right? We care about solidarity here, which is, I prefer solidarity to diversity. Because then it's like, well, why can't you just be happy with the fact that we had Andre Henry come speak here? Why can't you just be happy that we have a racial justice group or that we read racial justice books? At a certain point, you have to ask the question, are you still having black and brown people in this space as second-class parishioners?
Yep. I want to just take a few minutes left. Are there questions, brief questions that folks have? Thoughts? Got one over here.
Good morning, my dear. Pleasure to meet you. You just said, you mentioned a word just now, a second-class parishioner. Could you tell me what that is?
I'm not sure what part of that is unclear, but it's basically like what I just said, is that when we talk, okay, white institutional space is established first and foremost with the interests of whites in mind. So, I mean, it's not my first time at All Saints, and I know some black and brown parishioners here who have described walking into this space as violent. That's why they come to the first service. They don't have to deal with as much of the iconography that descends directly from European traditions of Christianity. Now, if they can't see those changes happen, then at a certain point we have to answer the question that why is because our priority is to keep the people who are comfortable with things as they are comfortable, right? There is a hierarchy there. And I understand it's easier said than done, but the part of the difficulty, and I know this may not feel gentle, but I'm Jamaican. I don't know. Listen, we're direct. I don't know how to help you with that, Part of the difficulty is there are intangible barriers. There are attachments, right? So what would it take for you to get some black iconography in your sanctuary? What would it take? You have money though, right? You have the money. So then what's the barrier? There's some will. Yes, it's the desire. Someone's gonna be upset. Is it okay to upset them? Apparently not. But it is okay to upset the people who don't see themselves represented in that iconography, who don't hear their traditions of Christian faith being sung on Sunday morning, And I'm not saying it never happens, but I feel like I've belabored the point. Yeah?
Let's keep going.
Well, other people want to ask questions, but I think y'all see what I'm saying is that I know that explicitly there's no hierarchy, but once we start talking about the way you're making decisions, that hierarchy reveals itself.
Hi, Andre. Thank you so much for being here. Something just keeps coming to my mind, and I feel like I have to sort of add it into the conversation. I was listening to a podcast with Lovey Ajayi Jones a couple weeks ago, and she said, we don't need allies, what we need are accomplices. And the difference is that if I'm an accomplice, and you call me at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you say, Julianne, this thing has to happen right now, I say, okay, I'm up, I got my keys, where are you? I'm on my way. If I'm an ally and you say, hey, this thing is going on, I'm like, oh, Andre, that's so hard. I'm with you, I support you. What can I do? What do you, and that's the difference. And so we need to stop sort of sitting back and we need to get on our feet and get our keys and move.
I might transgress some liberal orthodoxy here. I feel like the language keeps changing, and I'm not interested in it. And I understand why people have made this distinction between ally and accomplice. But here's where I am now. I still feel like the problem with this language is that it still assumes that white supremacy is primarily my problem. Remember Kwame Ture said, if a man wants to lynch me, that's his problem. If he has the power to lynch me, that's my problem, right? And here's what I'm trying to say. I don't think that white people understand that you have been colonized too. And when you think about that, I think that a lot of white people are okay with the fact that you've been colonized because it kind of works out to your benefit, right? Like colonization on your end, you're not on the wrong side of it, And it doesn't bother you. It doesn't keep you up at night. You don't wake up every morning and say, how can I stop being colonized? Because it's not a source of harm for you. But I wake up every day and say, how can I stop being colonized? Because colonization for me means that I might be shot in the back like Anthony McLean. I might get killed by the police when I call for mental health like J.R. Thomas, right? The fact of colonization looms over my life like a rain cloud, like a tornado that might come over the horizon at any moment. And until white people are uncomfortable with the ways that somebody's ancestor, somebody's predecessor decided that white people don't need to empathize with black and brown people. White people are above that. White people get to have more resources. Until it affects you like that, we're not getting out of this situation. So like the other night, not to set myself up like as above anyone, but you know what I did with my Friday night? I was up till 2 a.m. on newtacticsforhumanrights.org looking at their tactical mapping tool to see, because they're mapping it out to where you get as granular as possible. So get the officer and the unarmed black man on this diagram and then start mapping out what are their relationships until you're at the international level and figure out what tactics you can do to interrupt that relationship between those two. That's how I spent Friday night, because I don't want to live in a world where I don't feel safe anymore. Not because, any other reason you can think of. No, it's because I personally do not feel safe. And until white people understand or feel that in their heart, this world is not right. It's not right for me to live in this world this way. I don't want to be in this position in society. And that's why I say, I don't care, ally, accomplice. No, when will you realize, like Lilla Watson said, if you have come here to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because you realize that your liberation, because you need to be liberated too, is bound to my liberation, then let us work together.
Amen.
I'm sorry, it got real.
No, that's great. I wish we had another hour, and if you would give us your time at another time, we'd be grateful to have you here.
Absolutely.
The book is All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. We might have a couple copies. We have 3, it's going down, copies left over there. If not, you can run by Vromans. Andre Henry, everybody.